Summer 1945. The air smelled of rain and ash, as if the sky itself had been burned and washed clean in the same breath. Lieutenant Hana Koyanagi sat on the wooden bench of the swaying truck, hands folded tightly in her lap, her nurse's cap long lost somewhere between surrender and transport. Beside her, Corporal Aiko Sato hummed under her breath, a tune so faint it was swallowed by the rumble of the engine. The road stretched through wet jungle, puddles flashing like shards of broken glass as the convoy passed. Each jolt sent a ripple through the group of women huddled together. Nurses, clerks, and orderlies, all survivors of the Philippines campaign, all prisoners of a war that had finally ended. Their khaki uniforms, once pressed and proper, hung limp with sweat and salt. Mariko Fujita, the oldest among them, stared straight ahead, her back rigid as a rifle. She had been through 3 postings, 2 retreats, and 1 near execution by friendly fire, and she had learned the art of keeping her face unreadable. Only the faint twitch at the corner of her eye betrayed her exhaustion. Next to her, Private Yumiko Tanaka clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, the last piece of home she owned, a frayed photograph of her parents and the persimmon orchard behind their house. She pressed it so hard it left creases in her palms. The truck hit another rut. Hana glanced at Aiko, who grinned despite the bruise forming on her cheekbone. "If this road doesn't kill us, nothing will," Aiko said in a low voice. A few of the women stifled laughter. Nervous, brittle. Even laughter felt dangerous here, as though the jungle might punish them for it. What awaited them at the end of the road was a mystery they could only imagine in fragments of rumor. For years they had been told what Americans did to prisoners. Stories whispered in barracks about starvation, humiliation, experiments. Mothers used the word Yankee like a curse. Surrender was supposed to be worse than death. And yet here they were, alive, bruised but breathing, heading deeper into enemy territory. Rain began to fall, fat drops thudding on the canvas cover overhead. The air grew heavy with wet earth, the smell of it mixing with diesel fumes and the sour tang of sweat. Hana closed her eyes and tried to picture her family in Kanazawa, tried to imagine the tiled roofs untouched by bombers, her mother stirring miso soup in the kitchen. She told herself they were alive, she had to believe it, but the image flickered like a lantern struggling in the wind. The convoy finally slowed. Through the flap, Hana caught sight of barbed wire glinting silver in the rain, guard towers rising like skeletal watchmen. The camp was smaller than she had expected. Rows of wooden barracks, a flagpole with the stars and stripes hanging limp in the humidity. Beyond the wire, astonishingly, came the sound of laughter. A group of American soldiers were playing baseball on a muddy field, their shouts ringing in the wet air. The sight was so absurd, so jarring, that Yumiko gasped aloud. "This is a prison?" Aiko murmured, incredulous. "Don't relax," Mariko said sharply. "Appearances lie." The truck braked hard, and the women were ordered out. Boots splashed into the mud, skirts soaked at the hem. Captain Robert Hayes stood waiting for them near the gate. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform clean despite the rain. His expression was unreadable but not unkind. He saluted once, crisply, then gestured for them to follow. Inside the camp, the strangeness deepened. The barracks smelled of damp wood and soap, not filth. Cots had been lined up neatly, blankets folded. On a nearby clothesline, laundry flapped in the rain, American and Filipino uniforms drying side by side. The women exchanged glances, each trying to decipher the rules of this place. "Mess hall's this way," Hayes said in careful, accented Japanese, surprising them into silence. "You'll eat first. Medical check after." Hana felt her stomach clench at the mention of food. They had eaten little for days, watery rice, a handful of beans. As they filed into the mess hall, the scent struck her first, something warm, buttery, laced with cinnamon. The smell seemed to wrap around her, startling in its sweetness. The hall itself was plain but bright, its long tables scrubbed clean. An American cook, sleeves rolled up, ladled soup into tin bowls as the women stepped forward. Beside the soup sat thick slices of bread, glistening with butter. And there, at the far end of the counter, sat a row of steaming pies, their golden crusts crackling slightly in the heat. Hana blinked. She had never seen anything like it. "Is this safe?" Yumiko whispered, as though the pies might be some elaborate trick. Aiko smirked. If this is poison, I'll die happy. The cook grinned and cut generous wedges, sliding them onto tin plates. The women took them hesitantly, fingers trembling. They sat at the far end of a table, eating silently at first, wary of the American soldiers scattered around the hall. The soup was thick with beans and carrots. The bread melted on their tongues. But it was the pie that undid them. The crust was flaky, the filling rich with sugar and spice, the apples tart and soft all at once. Hannah took one careful bite, then another, her throat tightening. She hadn't tasted sweetness like this since childhood, since before the war. Mariko, who had been silent all day, closed her eyes and exhaled as though releasing years of tension. Even Yumiko, pale and hollow-eyed, managed a small, startled smile. "This is ridiculous," Aiko said finally, her voice unsteady. "We're supposed to be prisoners, not guests at some American feast." "Maybe they're fattening us for slaughter," another woman whispered, and a ripple of uneasy laughter passed down the table. Hannah set her fork down carefully. The room felt suddenly too bright, too loud, the clatter of cutlery, the smell of cinnamon, the strange warmth in her chest. She had braced for punishment, for starvation, for whatever vengeance the victors might demand. Instead, she found herself fed, sheltered, treated almost gently. The dissonance left her unmoored. When they finished eating, Hayes reappeared at the door. "Barracks inspection next," he said. "Then rest." As they rose, Hannah caught the cook watching them with a faint smile. He gave a small, almost shy nod, as though to say, "You are safe here." Outside, the rain had stopped. The ground steamed in the fading light, the camp quiet except for the faint crack of a baseball hitting a mitt somewhere beyond the fence. The women walked back to the barracks in silence, the taste of apples lingering like an afterimage. Later, lying on her cot, Hannah opened the small notebook she kept hidden in her uniform pocket. With the stub of a pencil, she sketched the mess hall table, the curve of the pie slice on its plate. Underneath, she wrote in tiny characters, "Today, we did not die. Today, we tasted something like peace." Mariko sat on the edge of her own cot, staring at the ceiling. "This won't last," she said finally. "Don't let your guard down." But Hannah did not reply. She was still tasting cinnamon, still feeling the warmth in her belly. For the first time since capture, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to unclench her hands. Perhaps this was not mercy. Perhaps it was merely order, or duty, or politics. Yet it felt like something larger, something that cracked open a door inside her chest. Outside, a whistle blew, signaling lights out. The barracks dimmed. Yumiko whispered a prayer under her breath, and Aiko whispered a joke about pie gods, earning a soft chuckle from the women nearby. The sound was strange and beautiful, like glass breaking in reverse, shards turning whole again. Hannah closed her notebook and lay back, staring at the dark rafters overhead. Tomorrow they might face news of their families, of their ruined cities. Tomorrow might bring grief too great to bear. But tonight, her stomach was full, and the sweetness lingered. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, an American gramophone began to play a slow, crackling waltz. She turned her face toward the sound and let the music carry her. For the first time since the surrender, she felt the faintest flutter of something that might one day become hope. And then the floodlights outside blazed to life, flooding the barracks with white. A shout echoed from the guard tower, sharp and urgent. Hannah bolted upright, heart pounding, the taste of apples suddenly sharp in her mouth. Whatever this camp was, it had just reminded them. They were still prisoners, and the war was not done with them yet. The floodlights dimmed at dawn, leaving the camp washed in pale gold. Hannah rose with the first clang of the bell, the wooden floor cold beneath her bare feet. Outside, mist curled around the fence like a living thing. She breathed deeply, trying to steady the strange tightness in her chest left by last night's alarm. The guard's shouts had eventually quieted, and the women had been ordered back to bed, no explanation given. Now the air smelled of wet grass and boiled coffee. Somewhere near the kitchen, a pan clattered, and the faint, impossible aroma of apples drifted out again. They lined up for roll call, hair still damp from hurried washing. Aiko's uniform was spattered with mud from last night, but she wore it like a badge. "If we survive this war," she murmured to Hannah, I will tell everyone I fought bravely against this mud." Hannah bit back a smile. Mariko, standing at the head of their line, shot them both a sharp look, but her lips twitched almost imperceptibly. Captain Hayes appeared, hat tucked under his arm, his manner brisk but not cruel. He counted them quickly, nodded once, and gestured them toward the mess hall. The wooden building glowed faintly with lamplight, and the women hesitated at the door as though stepping into another world. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the scent of yeast, butter, and spice. The cook, Sergeant Bill Murphy, his hair the color of rust, stood behind the counter, hands on his hips. "Mornin', ladies," he said in slow, careful English, as though he expected his words to carry across a great distance. "Breakfast." The trays were lined with thick oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and bread still steaming from the oven. But again, it was the pie that caught their eyes, round and golden, waiting patiently at the end of the counter. Hannah's pulse quickened. It was not the fear of the night before, but something stranger, lighter, as though her body remembered the sweetness and craved it again. They ate slowly, almost reverently. The oatmeal was heavy but comforting, the eggs soft as clouds. The pie, smaller slices this time, but no less fragrant, was crisp at the edges, the filling still warm. Yumiko closed her eyes with the first bite, a sound escaping her that was half sigh, half prayer. Across the table, Aiko licked a smear of filling from her thumb. "If this is enemy food," she said dryly, "I will happily betray the Emperor for seconds." The other women stared at her for a heartbeat, then burst into laughter, short, sharp, almost guilty. It felt dangerous to laugh in this place, yet it was as though the sound broke some invisible ice. After breakfast, Hayes directed them to a makeshift infirmary. Hannah, who had spent years tending the wounded, found her hands clenching involuntarily at the sight of clean cots and folded bandages. An American medic examined them one by one, his touch brisk but respectful. Malaria scars were noted, injuries cleaned. When he reached Mariko, he frowned at the old bullet wound along her arm. She sat stiff as a post while he treated it, her jaw locked. "You were lucky," he said in halting Japanese, and Mariko's eyes flickered, whether in gratitude or resentment, Hannah could not tell. Outside, the camp hummed with ordinary life. Soldiers carried crates, laundry flapped on lines, and somewhere someone was whistling a tune Hannah didn't know. It was as if the war had been pressed out of this place, leaving a hollow that ordinary routines had rushed in to fill. That afternoon, they were assigned light tasks, washing linens, sorting medical supplies. Aiko took to the work with a strange cheer, joking that she might be promoted for her expert folding technique. Even Mariko seemed to loosen, though she said little. In the evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky with bruised pinks and gold, Hayes appeared again. This time, he carried a photograph. "Family," he said, showing them a young woman standing on a porch with a pie cooling beside her. The smile on the woman's face was easy, unguarded. "She looks kind," Yumiko whispered. "Her name's Ruth," Hayes said, and for a moment he looked less like an officer and more like a man very far from home. "She makes pies better than Murphy's." "Lies," Murphy called from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands. "No one makes pies better than mine." The women laughed, and the sound startled Hannah with its brightness. That night, lying in her bunk, Hannah opened her notebook again. She sketched the photograph, the woman, the porch, the pie, and felt something loosen in her chest. Perhaps it was foolish to draw comfort from a stranger's smile, from a dessert served in a prison camp. But the sketch felt like a small rebellion against despair, a way of claiming some piece of the world still worth remembering. The next days passed in a rhythm that felt almost human. Each morning brought work, meals, and the now-anticipated pie. It became more than food. It became ritual. Aiko began calling it the truce pie, and the name stuck. Even Mariko, who resisted sentiment, would sit a little straighter when it was served, as though saluting some private, invisible flag. But there were moments that reminded them they were not free. The barbed wire caught the sunset like teeth, the guards' rifles glinted in the light. The women were escorted everywhere in pairs. The war was over, but captivity was a constant whisper at their backs. One afternoon, after their tasks were complete, Hayes permitted them to sit in the shade near the edge of the compound. From there, they could see the world beyond the fence, the dirt road, the distant palms, the wide sky. Hannah felt an ache in her chest so sharp she pressed her hand against it. Home was somewhere across that horizon, across a sea filled with ships and ruins and ghosts. "Do you think we will ever go back?" Yumiko asked softly. Mariko's gaze did not leave the horizon. "If we do, we will not be the same women who left." That night, after the pie was served, Aiko leaned across the table. "We should try to make one," she said suddenly, her eyes bright. "If we are to eat like Americans, we should learn how they do it." Murphy laughed so hard he nearly dropped a tray. "You want my kitchen? You'll burn it down." "Teach us," Aiko said, not smiling now. "If we are to be prisoners, let us learn something before we leave." Murphy studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Tomorrow," he said. The next day was a comedy of errors. Flour dusted every surface, and every face. Butter slipped from warm fingers, crusts tore, apples spilled. Murphy cursed, but only half-heartedly. By the time the pies went into the oven, the barracks smelled like a storm of sugar. When the pies came out, they were nearly black at the edges, the filling bubbling over like a small, sticky volcano. The women stared at them in dismay. "Well," Aiko said solemnly, "we have invented a new weapon." Even Mariko laughed then, a sound so rare that the other women joined in until their sides ached. The soldiers who passed by shook their heads, grinning, and Murphy handed them slices of his own pie to soften the blow. That night, Hannah wrote in her notebook, "Today we tried to make peace with our own hands. It burned, it broke, but it was ours." It was the first time she allowed herself to believe there might be life after this camp. The weeks blurred into each other, each one slightly lighter than the last. The pie became less a novelty and more a signpost, a marker that they had survived another day. They began to speak more openly with the soldiers, to trade words and gestures, to share jokes that crossed the barrier of language. But one evening, as the sun sank behind the palms and the sky turned the color of rust, Hayes came to their barracks with a folded paper in his hand. His face was solemn. "The war is truly over now," he said. "Orders have come down. The camp will close soon. You will be sent home." The words hung in the air like smoke. Hannah felt her heart kick hard in her chest. Home, the word no longer sounded simple. Japan was not the same place they had left. Would there be a house to return to? A family? Yumiko's hands shook as she clutched her photograph. Aiko's face was unreadable for once. Even Mariko's composure cracked, her jaw tightening. Hannah stared down at the table, where a few crumbs of pie still clung to the plate. Tomorrow, perhaps, they would eat it again. But soon there would be no more mess hall, no more Murphy's booming laugh, no more uneasy kindness from their captors. The ritual that had carried them through captivity would end. The bell rang for lights out. Hayes nodded once and left them to their thoughts. The barracks was silent except for the sound of rain beginning to fall again, soft as breath. Hannah turned over in her bunk, the taste of cinnamon still on her tongue. The thought of going home filled her with a fear sharper than any she had felt on the day of surrender. The war had ended, but she sensed the hardest journey was still ahead. Outside, thunder rolled far off, as if some giant hand were drumming on the sky. Hannah closed her eyes, her fists curling into the blanket. When the morning came, the pie would be there again, golden and warm, but each bite would taste like a countdown. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the long, mournful call of a ship's horn from the bay, a sound that told her the world beyond the wire was already waiting. The days that followed Hayes's announcement felt strangely heavier, as though the air itself carried the weight of departure. The camp's rhythms went on, the bell, the work details, the meals, but everything seemed touched by an invisible countdown. Each slice of pie felt rarer, as though they were eating through the last of something precious. One humid afternoon, as they hung damp laundry near the barracks, a guard approached carrying a bundle of letters and newspapers. The women froze. For weeks they had been living in a suspended world, disconnected from the outside. Now, suddenly, the outside had come to meet them. The guard handed the papers to Hayes, who distributed them carefully. Some were from Japanese prisoners in other camps, some from American authorities. Hana's fingers trembled as she unfolded a sheet bearing news from Kanazawa. The words swam before her eyes: bombings in nearby cities, rail lines cut, famine warnings. No word about her family. Beside her, Yumiko made a small sound and crumpled to her knees, clutching a telegram that confirmed her parents' village had been destroyed in the final air raids. Hana knelt beside her, holding her shoulders while Yumiko shook with silent sobs. For the first time since capture, the war's true cost entered the camp like a cold wind. That evening, the mess hall was quiet. The pie slices sat untouched longer than usual. When Hana finally took a bite, the sweetness was sharp, almost painful, as though her tongue had learned grief's new taste. Mariko broke the silence first. "I used to think surrender was the greatest shame," she said, her voice rough. "But now I think living might be." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Aiko, who usually met sorrow with defiance, said softly, "If we live, we have to make it mean something." She glanced toward the kitchen, where Murphy was clattering pans. "Maybe even learn to bake something that doesn't burn." The women laughed, a thin sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. Even in their grief, something in them reached toward light. The next morning, Hayes found Hana sitting outside, sketching in her notebook. He crouched beside her, studying the page, a rough drawing of the pie, but this time the crust was cracked, the filling spilling out like a wound. "You're an artist," he said. "Not really," Hana replied in halting English. Hayes pointed to the drawing. "This is how you feel." She hesitated, then nodded. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "You should keep drawing, even the bad feelings. It helps." She watched him go, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. Later that day, she sketched again, this time the barracks, the fence, the distant baseball field. The pages began to fill with fragments of this strange life. The women's faces bent over their work, Murphy's wide grin, Yumiko's hands folded over her photograph like prayer beads. One afternoon, Hay surprised them by bringing a crate of Red Cross supplies. Chocolate bars, soap, a deck of playing cards. The chocolate melted in the heat before they could finish it, leaving sticky fingers and smeared smiles. Aiko learned to shuffle cards and taught the others a clumsy game of poker. The guards watched, amused, as the women bet imaginary fortunes and accused each other of cheating. But the ghosts of war were never far. At night, Yumiko sometimes woke screaming. Mariko would sit by her bed until she quieted, her face carved from shadow. Hana began dreaming of Kanazawa, of streets filled with ash, of her mother's hands reaching through smoke. One evening, as the sun sank behind the palms, Mariko finally spoke of the day she had been wounded. "It was near Batan," she said quietly, sitting on the barracks steps. "We were retreating. My unit was out of food, out of ammunition. Men were dying in the mud, calling for their mothers. I was hit in the arm. When I woke, everyone was gone." The other women sat very still. "I crawled for hours before I found another unit," Mariko continued. "I swore then that if I ever had to choose between capture and death, I would choose death." She looked down at her bandaged arm. "But I didn't. And now here we are." Hana reached out, touching her hand. "And because you lived, we are not alone here." Mariko did not answer, but her hand tightened briefly before she rose and went inside. That night, as though to ward off the heaviness, Murphy appeared with a new experiment, a pie made with tinned peaches instead of apples. "War shortage," he said. "Apples are running low." The women tasted the pie cautiously. It was sweeter, stickier, the crust darker. Aiko licked her fork. "If we must be prisoners, at least let it be in a country that bakes well," she said, earning another round of laughter. But Hana noticed something shift in her chest as she ate. Each bite was delicious, but it reminded her that this feast was borrowed time. Soon there would be no peaches, no apples, no crust or cinnamon. Only the long road home, and whatever waited there. The next morning brought another kind of news. Hayes gathered them by the fence and pointed to the distant hills, where smoke curled into the sky. "That's from Manila," he said. "The last Japanese holdouts surrendered yesterday. The fighting is truly finished now." The women stood silently, watching the smoke drift like a funeral banner. Later that afternoon, Hayes approached Hannah again. "Would you like to send a message?" he asked. She stared at him blankly. "To Kanazawa," he explained. "Through the Red Cross." Her heart lurched. For a moment she could see it clearly. Her father opening the letter, her mother holding it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," Hannah said finally. That evening, she sat with paper and pencil, the other women gathered quietly around her. She wrote in careful strokes, "I am alive. I am safe. I will come home when I can." She hesitated, then added, "I tasted something sweet today, and I thought of you." When she handed the letter to Hayes, he read it silently, then folded it with a nod. That night, Hannah dreamed again of home, but this time the streets were not in ruins. The persimmon trees were heavy with fruit, and the air smelled of cinnamon. The following week brought storms. Rain hammered the tin roofs, turning the yard to mud. Work details were cancelled, and the women crowded into the barracks, passing the time with cards and stories. Aiko began telling outrageous tales of her childhood in Osaka, embellishing until even Mariko was smiling. But when the rain stopped and the sun returned, the world outside seemed sharper, more immediate. The fences gleamed like wet bones. The guards looked restless. Then, one morning, a truck arrived at the gate. Hayes called them together. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start moving you to the port. From there, a ship will take you back to Japan." The words struck like a hammer. For weeks they had waited for this, yet now the idea of leaving felt like stepping into a void. That night, the mess hall served the last of the apple pies. Murphy stood behind the counter, arms folded, watching them eat. His usual grin was gone. "Next time," he said gruffly, "you'll have to bake your own." Aiko saluted him with her fork. "If we burn them, we'll blame you." When the plates were cleared, Hannah lingered a moment, looking at the long wooden table, at the light slanting through the windows. She tried to memorize it all, the warmth of the room, the hum of conversation, the smell of cinnamon. Back in the barracks, she opened her notebook one last time. She drew the pie, but this time whole, uncut, the crust unbroken. Underneath, she wrote, "This is what survival looks like." Outside, the night was quiet, the stars sharp above the dark palms. Hannah lay awake long after lights out, listening to the stillness. Tomorrow they would leave this place, this strange limbo where they had learned to laugh again, to mourn, to taste sweetness after years of bitterness. Far off, from the direction of the bay, came the sound of engines starting, deep and resonant. It sounded like a heartbeat. Hannah closed her eyes, feeling it in her chest, knowing it was meant for them. The dawn of departure came in a rush of noise and motion. The bell clanged before sunrise, echoing through the mist-heavy camp. Hannah woke instantly, heart racing, as though her body had been waiting for this moment. Around her, the barracks stirred. Mariko folded her blanket with military precision, her face unreadable. Yumiko tied her hair back with shaking hands, the frayed ribbon trembling between her fingers. Aiko grinned at no one in particular and said, "At least we won't have to scrub floors tomorrow." The laugh that followed was too loud, too bright, but it loosened something in all of them. Outside, trucks idled near the gate, exhaust curling into the gray air. The camp had a different hum this morning, a taut, electric energy, as though even the guards understood this was no ordinary day. Hayes stood waiting, clipboard in hand, his cap pulled low. His expression was serious, but when he saw the women approach, his mouth softened. "Before you go," he said, "the cook has something for you." Murphy appeared from the mess hall, carrying a tray so large it took both arms to steady it. On it sat the largest pie they had yet seen, its crust glossy, edges perfectly crimped. The steam rising from it curled like incense. For a moment, no one spoke. "This one's special," Murphy said, clearing his throat. "Figured it ought to be right, your last day here." They ate standing in the yard, the pie cut into thick wedges. The crust was flaky, the filling tart and sweet, the cinnamon warm on their tongues. It was, Hannah thought, the best of them all, or perhaps it only tasted that way because it was the last. Aiko wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said, "If you wanted us to stay, this would be the way to do it." Murphy laughed. but his eyes glistened. "Go on, get out of here before I have to bake another one." The women climbed into the truck, clutching the last crumbs in their hands like talismans. As the engine roared and the gate rolled open, Hannah turned to look back at the camp. The barracks stood in neat rows, the laundry lines were empty, the baseball field lay quiet. For a moment she saw it not as a prison but as a place where she had been remade, not by chains, but by kindness. The road wound toward the coast, the jungle steaming in the morning heat. The air smelled of wet leaves and salt. Hannah's hair whipped against her face as the truck picked up speed. Around her, the women sat silent, each lost in her own thoughts. Mariko's hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. Yumiko stared straight ahead, lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Aiko leaned back with her eyes closed, as though willing herself to dream. Hours later, they reached the port. Ships lay at anchor, their hulls streaked with rust and salt spray. The noise of loading crews rang across the docks, shouts, the clatter of chains, the groan of cranes lifting cargo. The women were led up a gangplank onto a transport ship. The deck smelled of tar and iron, the air thick with the tang of the sea. That night, the ship slipped from the harbor under a rising moon. Hannah stood at the rail, watching the coastline fade into shadow. The water stretched endless and black, swallowing the last lights of the camp. The wind tasted of brine and smoke. Somewhere below decks, someone played a harmonica, the notes low and haunting. Days passed in a rhythm as relentless as the tide. Meals were plain, rice, hard bread, thin soup, but the women ate in silence, grateful for anything that filled their stomachs. They slept in hammocks that swayed with the ship, their dreams restless. The sea was their new prison now, its horizon a wall they could not cross. One night, during a storm, the ship pitched so violently that the hammocks swung like pendulums. Lightning split the sky, illuminating faces drawn tight with fear. Hannah clung to the rope of her hammock, feeling the floor roll beneath her. Around her, the women whispered prayers into the dark. The storm passed by morning, leaving the sea calm as glass, but the memory of that night stayed with them, a reminder that survival was still something they had to earn. When at last Japan's coast came into view, the women crowded the deck. The shoreline was gray under a low sky, dotted with ruined buildings and twisted metal. Smoke rose in thin threads from distant villages. The dock they landed at was crowded with refugees, families searching for lost faces, children crying. The air smelled of soot and brackish water. They disembarked slowly, as though stepping onto another planet. The women stood together for a moment, uncertain where to go, their belongings clutched close. Mariko was the first to move, her back straight, her face set. "Come," she said. "We find what's left." They parted ways soon after, each heading toward a different corner of the country. Hannah's journey took her north, through villages scarred by bombings, past fields scorched black. She rode in crowded trains and walked when the tracks ran out, asking questions at every station, every shrine, until she finally reached Kanazawa. Her house still stood, roof patched, garden overgrown. Her mother opened the door, thinner than Hannah remembered but alive. They embraced wordlessly, tears streaming down both faces. Her father appeared, leaning on a cane, his eyes shining with disbelief. In the weeks that followed, Hannah tried to settle back into her old life, but something had shifted too deeply to undo. The war had left scars on the town, on her family, on her own heart. Nights were the hardest. She would wake with the smell of cinnamon in her nose, her hand reaching for a notebook no longer there. One autumn morning, while walking through the market, she saw a basket of apples. They were bruised and misshapen, but their scent struck her like a memory. She bought them all. With her mother's help, she borrowed a small oven and tried to remember everything she had watched Murphy do. Cutting the apples thin, mixing sugar with spice, rolling the dough just so. The crust burned the first time, but she tried again. And again. By winter, the pies were nearly perfect. Word spread quickly. Neighbors came to taste this strange American dessert. Some wept, some laughed, some said it was too sweet, but they all returned. The pies became Hannah's quiet rebellion against despair, a way of turning the war's bitter end into something gentler. Years later, a group of American soldiers, part of the occupation forces, stopped by her small shop. One of them picked up a slice, took a bite, and froze. "Tastes just like home," he said softly. Hannah smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "It tastes like survival," she said. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Hannah sat by the fire with her parents. The shop sign, a simple wooden board carved with the words "Peace Pies," swayed in the wind. She thought of Aiko, Mariko, Yumiko, of Hayes and Murphy, of the camp where the ritual began. She wondered if the others had found sweetness again, wherever they were. When she closed her eyes, she saw the camp's mess hall bathed in morning light, the final pie steaming on the tray. She saw the truck gate swinging open, the road stretching before them like a new life. And somewhere, in memory or in dream, the taste of cinnamon rose again, warm and sharp, as though reminding her that mercy, like pie, was meant to be shared, even between enemies.